Welcome to Inside Judicial Watch. I'm your host, Bruce Schlesman. With me today, we have Senior Attorney and Director of Election Integrity Project, Bob Popper. Thank you so much for coming by, Bob.
Great to be here.
So I just wanted to talk about your recent lawsuit victory with the state of California and Los Angeles County. Would you mind going into that and what happened, what transpired?
Sure. We sued Los Angeles County and the state of California, and we made a settlement with them that we very much like, in which they promised to abide by the federal law regarding cleaning their voter rolls. What we discovered in Los Angeles County was that they had inactive registrations that were the highest in the nation. They have 1.5 million inactive registrations. Now the viewers should understand in federal law what that means. An inactive registration is a registration belonging to someone who probably has moved out of state. And the federal law governing these matters is the National Voter Registration Act, and as a lawyer I probably won't resist referring to it as the NVRA, but that's what I'm talking about. The NVRA tells you that as a state, you send letters to people who you think have moved to other states. And you might find out through the post office, you might find out in any number of ways. And you send these letters. And if they respond, that's fine. You're bound by whatever they tell you. If they say they're still there, and that's that. If they don't respond, then it gets more complicated. If the letter comes back undeliverable or they just don't answer, then under federal law, what you do is you wait for 2 general federal elections, which is the complicated legalese way of saying 2 to 4 years.
Okay.
And then they can be removed from the voter rolls.
Okay.
I like to point out to people, by the way, just as an aside, that being removed from the voter rolls is not like losing your job. It's not like getting in a car accident. It's not like getting divorced. I mean, it's not a major life event. You just go re-register, okay? But the law is so careful and so respectful of people's right to vote that it takes a letter notification and 2 to 4 years. And if at any time you vote during that period, you're back on the active list. The whole clock stops. You're not going to be removed anymore. And you don't have to vote by provisional ballot. You just show up and you vote. So inactive registrations can be voted. And the number of inactive registrations you have is an indication of how well you're complying with the federal law requiring you to clean your voter rolls.
I'm glad you pointed out that whole process. So it sounds like there's a very reasonable, systemic process for maintaining election integrity and voter rolls. So we've talked a lot about voter rolls, what they are, kind of like active registrants versus inactive registrants. What's the importance of cleaning your voter rolls? Why is that important for a state to abide by that?
Well, it affects a couple of things. I mean, first, let's just start with it is federal law. Most people know the NVRA by its more colloquial name, the Motor Voter Bill. This was Bill Clinton's effort to pass a law that would increase access to the polls, and it has done this. It has done this. And the other half of that bill was the integrity provision, which required states to clean their voter rolls, to police them, to make sure that the people who live in Los Angeles County are accurately reflected on their voter rolls, and that people who live elsewhere aren't reflected on Los Angeles County's voter rolls. It was a compromise bill. Almost from the beginning, Democrats have tried to enforce only one half of that compromise. Bill Clinton, his Justice Department in 1998 gave a pass to California, essentially instructed them not to enforce the provision about mailing to people and asking them if they still reside in the state. They still did the mailings, but they didn't remove them after 2 general federal elections. They didn't remove them at all. It was like a historical record of everyone who ever was registered in California for 20 years. They've been doing this. Well, get to our lawsuit. We did a study a couple of years ago. The Federal Election Assistance Commission tracks how states are cleaning their voter rolls. And they release data every 2 years. And we took the last release of data. We analyzed it for all 3,100 counties. We were able to get good data for 2,600 of them, so for most of them. Of those, we found almost a fifth, or 470 counties, had more registered voters than citizens over the age of 18 who could register. That's an indication that you're not cleaning your voter rolls. And I have to say too, just because it's funny to me, a couple of counties had more registered voters than total population, including infants and non-citizens. Just a few. And it wasn't Los Angeles and it wasn't in California, but I always find that amusing. That's a high registration rate. Well, when you have more registered voters than citizens over the age of 18 who could register at all, one way to sort of summarize that statistic is to say a registration rate over 100%. Well, we did the data. We found that Los Angeles County had a registration rate of 112%. California as a whole had a registration rate of 101%. And Los Angeles County is huge. There are 40 million people in California. 10 million of them live in Los Angeles County, so that's 1/4 of the population. If Los Angeles County were a state, it would be the 9th largest state. If it were a state all on its own, it would be larger than 41 states. It's huge, and the inactive list, after 20 years of inaction in Los Angeles County, was 1.5 million. Now again, to put that into context, that's a lot of people. That's more than the population of 11 United States. Hawaii has 1.4 million. That's less than that's total population. That's less than the number of inactive registrations currently being carried on the books in Los Angeles County. The settlement agreement makes them have to fix that.
Okay.
If you're already on the clock, you have to be removed. Mm-hmm. On the clock just means that 2 to 4 year clock is ticking. You were sent a letter and you didn't respond. Mm-hmm. If you're not on the clock, they promise to send those people letters and start the clock. The agreement runs through 2025, so there's enough time to remove people, all the people who are currently inactive on California's voter rolls. And we're very happy with the settlement.
So not to point out the obvious, but a lot of this is to protect against things like corruption and voter fraud, correct?
Yes.
And with an unclean voter roll, you would probably have a lot of opportunity for that.
Yes. In addition to the fact that, as I said, it is federal law, it's part of a compromise bill, it's supposed to be enforced. Yeah. It does prevent voter fraud. And in fact, there's a hot discussion in this country over voter ID. And I'm all in on voter ID.
Okay.
And I think the rest of the country is too. I mean, in poll after poll, it's 70 to 80% approval. And it's majority approval among minority voters, among Hispanic voters, among black voters, among Democrats. Mm-hmm. People understand that voter ID makes sense. That being said, this is not the voter ID debate because it's larger. When you get rid of duplicate registrations or registrations for people who now live somewhere else, you do more to advance the cause of honest elections than even with voter ID. For example, you prevent double voting. Very typical situation is somebody lives in California. They move to Washington State, they move to Oregon. They keep their California registration because they just never cancel it. Mm-hmm. Then they can vote it by mail and still vote in Oregon. It's double voting, it's fraud, it's illegal, and large inactive registration lists ask for that to happen. That's the kind of thing that enforcing the NVRA will prevent. Absentee ballot fraud is probably the most common kind of fraud, or registration fraud. Both of these kinds of fraud are addressed by removing inactives from your registration list, and even, as I said, more effectively than voter ID. Bear in mind, with voter ID, someone is lying about who they are. They're trying to vote without being the person whose name they're signing. With the NVRA, you're addressing double voting. In double voting, a person is who they say they are. That's not going to be fixed with a good voter ID. Mm-hmm. Their voter ID is valid.
Yeah.
Okay, they're just voting in two places. So it has much broader anti-fraud potential. And something else I always love to point out is that it helps get out the vote efforts and voter education efforts to have clean voter rolls. When you are mailing, everyone on California's voter registration database, if you're sending pieces of mail out to everyone in Los Angeles County who could vote, so that's 7.5 million people on their voter registration list, including the 1.5 million inactives. You are wasting a lot of postage. 23% of that registration list belongs to people who don't live in California anymore. That's a tremendous waste of money. If you're sending people door to door to knock on doors based on a voter registration list, and you're sending them to addresses where 23% they're going to knock and there's not going to be anyone home, or it's going to be the wrong person, you're wasting your time. You're trying to target the people you're trying to get the vote out from, or to inspire to vote, or to take to the polls. Yeah. And the NVRA helps that sort of thing as well.
So why, if 70 to 80% of the country supports this, why is there so much resistance from elements on the left and from states like California to enforce something so many people support and enforce basic ideas like election integrity or cleaning voter rolls?
Well, speculating about other people's intentions is always inherently risky, but that being said,
that's true.
There's a couple of factors. First, I would say laziness and not wanting to spend money. I mean, it takes effort to clean up the voter rolls. It costs money to make mailings to people and ask them if they're still there. You need a database to keep track of the response, to remove them. You need computer people. Mm-hmm. You need an infrastructure that'll do it, and it has to be properly funded and inspired. I guess I could speculate on more nefarious motives, which is, or simply, let's call them partisan motives. I mean, there are people who believe that it would be better for their party if there were more people who had, no obstacles to registering and to keeping their registration current, and they don't have to worry about whether they throw letters away that they should be responding to, and they don't have to take the trouble, which, as I've pointed out, isn't a very big trouble, but they don't have to go through the trouble of re-registering. And all the way to, I imagine there are people who would like there to be the opportunities for fraud. And every election we see that. We see people who do engage in fraud. We saw that in North Carolina famously this last election. Possibly in Florida this last election. I mean, you see that. The last thing I would say is that it might be a very good fundraiser for certain partisan elements, to say that you're being cheated, your vote is being robbed, and it's not true. This is a sensible, restrained, slow-moving law, and the only consequences, if it gets things wrong, is that you have to re-register.
Yeah, that's not much of a step, as you mentioned. It's not life-changing. It's pretty reasonable. It's pretty measured. So we've had similar lawsuits in the past. And do you want to talk a little bit about the most recent one in Kentucky, where we also, it was about voter rolls too, correct?
It was. Yeah. And, it's because, we don't have the staff that the Justice Department has. Yeah. And I would say, as an aside, that one of the evidences of the war on the NVRA, that I was talking about, that Bill Clinton engaged in when he sort of shut down its enforcement in California, or his Justice Department did. I worked at the Department of Justice during the Obama administration, and the Obama administration didn't bring a single lawsuit under this statute to compel a state to clean up its voter rolls.
That's amazing.
I brought the last one at the Department of Justice in 2007. And I since left, and now I brought more here than the entire Obama administration did in its 8 years.
That is amazing. That's...
Well, yeah, again, it's making war on half the statute. And I'm sorry, I have a lot of asides. Here's another one. In Florida, the U.S. government joined litigants to argue that certain protections within the NVRA applied to non-citizens who were registered.
That's insane.
Well, it's the law in the 11th Circuit. There's something in the NVRA called the freeze period, and during the freeze period, you can't remove anyone. It's 90 days right before an election.
Okay.
And the lawsuit determined you can't remove non-citizens.
Even right before the election because of that.
Even though they have never lawfully been registered. They were never acceptably registered to vote. It was always either fraud or a mistake. But yes, in the 11th Circuit, that's making war on the NVRA. Well, when you're Judicial Watch doing the work that the Justice Department ought to be doing, you have to pick your lawsuits, and because there's so much non-compliance with the NVRA, it was easy. Los Angeles County was an easy call with 1.5 million registrations that were inactive. Kentucky was an easy call. 40% of their counties had more registered voters than citizens over the age of 18. 40%. And the explanation, like California, like Los Angeles, was simple. Since 2012, when the new Secretary of State came in, Secretary Grimes, they simply hadn't been enforcing that part of the statute at all. You don't enforce a statute for 6 years, it's going to go bad. You don't enforce, the voter rolls are going to go bad. Voter rolls go bad immediately. If your voter rolls were clean today, people would move away. People would, start dying. They become inaccurate, and over a period of 6 years, over a period of 20 for sure, they're going to become inaccurate. So.
Which is why it's so important to constantly clean them, like we've been saying this whole time.
Exactly, or to inspire states to clean them by suing them. And so in Kentucky, we got a consent decree, which is a court-ordered stipulated agreement. And it requires them to take the steps that Los Angeles is now required to do to clean up their voter rolls.
So in closing, we've gone over a lot about this topic. Is there anything that Judicial Watch does from here going forward? Are there any upcoming lawsuits? Where do we go forward from here in election integrity?
Well, more low-hanging fruit. A new data release comes out from the Election Assistance Commission in about 5 months. And even before then, we can sort of identify which states and counties are probably not going to have a very good record under that data release. And we look at it and we hire a demographer and we analyze it again and we sue more states.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a very enlightening conversation about election integrity.
Well, thanks for having me anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on Inside Judicial Watch. Please be sure to like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and be sure to check out more videos and support our work online. Thank you for joining us.